The year was 1932, and the air in Bradford, Pennsylvania, hung heavy with the smell of unrefined crude oil and the stinging cold reality of the Great Depression. Bradford was not a city of lights and glamour. It was a rough-hewn industrial outpost carved into the Allegheny Mountains, a place where men worked hard, drilled deep, and watched their fortunes evaporate as the national economy collapsed around them. The mood in the town was bleak. The oil boom that had once made millionaires out of roughnecks had dried up, leaving behind rusting derricks and a population clinging to the edge of survival. In this atmosphere of scarcity, where every nickel was counted and every possession was expected to last a lifetime, a man named George Bladel stepped out onto the terrace of the Bradford Country Club. It was a summer evening, but the social gathering inside felt strained. The dance was a grim pantomime of wealth. Men in frayed suits drank cheap whiskey and pretended that the banks weren't failing. Blaisdell, a man who had already tasted failure in the oil business, was looking for a light. He watched a friend of his, a local businessman who was trying to maintain an air of dignity, pull a lighter from his pocket to light a cigarette. The device was an awkward, clunky piece of brass manufactured in Austria. To operate it, the man had to stop his conversation, put down his drink, and use both hands. He had to pull off a removable metal cap, hold the body of the lighter with one hand, and spin the flint wheel with the other. It was a clumsy, fumbling ritual. The cap was easily lost. The mechanism was dented. In the elegance of a country club, even a fading one, the device looked like a piece of industrial debris. Bladel watched the struggle with a critical eye. He asked his friend, somewhat sarcastically, why a man of his standing was using such a terrible lighter. The friend looked at him, shielded the flame with his hand, and replied with a sentence that would change the course of American manufacturing. Well, it works. That simple defense struck Blaisdell like a physical blow. In a world where everything was breaking, the stock market, the government, the promise of the American dream, the only thing that mattered was utility. The Austrian lighter was ugly, yes. It was inconvenient, certainly. But it had one redeeming quality that saved it from the trash heap. It produced fire even when the wind was blowing. The genius of the Austrian design was a perforated metal chimney that surrounded the wick. This chimney disrupted the airflow, creating a zone of low pressure that kept the flame alive even in a stiff breeze. Bladel realized in that moment that the core technology was sound, but the user interface was a disaster. The reliance on two hands was the fatal flaw. A man needed one hand free to hold a tool, to hold a steering wheel, to hold a woman, or to hold a weapon. Bladel didn't invent the concept of the lighter, just as Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile. But Blaisdell understood something that the Austrian inventors did not. He understood the psychology of the American pocket. He realized that a tool needed to be more than just functional. It needed to be seamless. It needed to be an extension of the hand. He acquired the American distribution rights for the Austrian lighter, but he couldn't sell them. They were too clunky. So he retreated to a small workshop above a garage on Boylston Street. He had no grand factory. He had second-hand equipment, a corner of a machine shop, and a vision of a rectangular brass box. He took the Austrian chimney and threw away the rest of the casing. He fabricated a new housing. It was rectangular, fitting perfectly into the palm. It had rounded corners to stop it from tearing the lining of a trouser pocket. But the masterstroke was the hinge. Bladel soldered a small hinge onto the lid, connecting it permanently to the body. This seemingly minor addition transformed the object. Now, with a flick of the wrist or a snap of the thumb, the lid could be thrown open. The flame could be struck, The lid could be snapped shut to snuff the fire, all with one hand. The sound was accidental, but it became legendary. The cam that held the lid closed created a tension that, when released, caused the brass lid to strike the brass body with a distinctive resonant clink. It was a metallic musical note that signaled readiness. Bladel needed a name for his creation. He was fascinated by another recent invention that was revolutionizing clothing: the zipper. He liked the modern, snappy sound of the word. It implied speed. It implied closure. He took the word zipper, twisted it around in his mouth, and settled on Zippo. It sounded instrumental. It sounded like something that did a job. In late 1932, the first Zippo lighter was produced. It retailed for $1.95. In the depths of the Depression, nearly $2 was a significant investment. It was the price of a good meal for a family. Bladel knew that if he was going to ask a man to part with that kind of money, he couldn't just sell him a novelty. He had to sell him a guarantee of permanence. This is where the true thesis of the Zippo empire was forged. Most companies in the 1930s were already beginning to experiment with the idea of planned obsolescence, making things that would break so the customer would have to buy them again. Bladel went in the exact opposite direction. He issued a guarantee that was suicidal by the standards of any business school. He promised that if a Zippo lighter ever failed to work, for any reason, regardless of the age or condition, the factory would fix it for free. Forever. He wasn't selling a fire starter. He was selling an antidote to the chaos of the era. The Zippo was a solid block of brass in a world that felt like it was made of paper. It was heavy. It smelled of naphtha fuel, a sharp, chemical scent that clung to the fingers. It required maintenance. You had to trim the wick. You had to replace the flint. You had to pour fluid into the rayon batting. But this maintenance was part of the bond. It wasn't a disposable plastic trinket. It was a machine that demanded respect. The invention of the Zippo was an accident of circumstance. If Bladel hadn't been on that balcony, if the wind hadn't been blowing, if his friend hadn't been struggling with the Austrian contraption, the world might never have known the click of that hinged lid. It was created by a man who wanted to be an industrialist, not a jeweler. He didn't build a lighter company. He built a foundry that manufactured confidence. He gave the American man a Promethean tool, a way to carry the primal power of fire in his pocket, encased in a metal shell that was tough enough to survive the hard times that were swallowing the country whole. The tragedy, which would not become apparent for decades, was that this obsession with permanence was a philosophy destined to lose the war against convenience. Bladel built a lighter for a world that fixed things. He didn't see that the world was slowly turning into a place that threw things away. But in the freezing winter of 1932, standing in his workshop with the smell of brass dust in the air, he snapped the lid shut on the very first unit, and the sound rang out like a gunshot, signaling the start of an empire built on a flame that was designed never to go out. The wind could blow as hard as it wanted. The chimney was ready. The depression could bite as deep as it wanted. The brass was solid. The Zippo was born not as a luxury, but as a survival tool for a generation that had forgotten what it felt like to have control over anything. The war machine. The transition from the small workshop above the garage to the massive manufacturing plant on Barber Street in Bradford, Pennsylvania, was the industrial equivalent of a frantic, adrenaline-fueled mobilization. By the late 1930s, the Zippo Manufacturing Company was no longer a curiosity. It was a thundering engine of American production. The factory was a cathedral of noise. It did not smell like a retail store. It smelled of the sharp, biting odor of cutting fluid, the metallic tang of brass shavings, and the pervasive, sweet chemical scent of naphtha fuel. Inside, the floor vibrated with the rhythm of heavy stamping presses. These were not delicate machines. They were multi-ton monsters that slammed down with the force of a train wreck, punching the rectangular cases out of sheets of raw brass. The air was filled with a fine gold dust, the byproduct of polishing wheels that spun at thousands of revolutions per minute. The men and women who worked there were not artisans in the traditional sense. They were industrial soldiers feeding the machines that birthed the most durable object in the American pocket. At the helm of this chaotic symphony was George Blaisdell. He had evolved from a desperate inventor into a P.T. Barnum of the industrial age. He understood that a product was nothing without a story, and he was determined to write that story in letters 10 feet tall. He commissioned the Zippo car, a Chrysler Saratoga with two colossal functional Zippo lighters built into the roof, complete with neon flames. He drove it across the country, a rolling monument to his own stubbornness. He was a man who believed in the tangible, in the heavy, in the real. But the true test of the factory and the philosophy behind it arrived on a Sunday morning in December of 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not just plunge the nation into war. It completely upended the supply chains of American industry. Suddenly, brass was more precious than gold. The United States government declared that copper and zinc, the two components of brass, were strategic materials essential for the production of artillery shells and bullet casings. The War Production Board issued a decree: no more brass for civilian manufacturing. For a company that built its entire reputation on a rust-proof, golden-hued brass case, this should have been a death sentence. Blaisdell did not fold. He did not close the factory. He looked at the stockpile of low-grade steel that was still available, a material that was prone to rusting, pitted easily, and looked ugly when polished. And he made a decision that would create the most iconic object of the Second World War. He ordered the factory to switch entirely to steel. But you couldn't polish this steel. It would rust the moment it touched the humid air of the Pacific or the damp trenches of Europe. So the engineers developed a thick, porous black paint. It was a crinkle finish, baked onto the metal at high temperatures until it formed a hard, uneven skin that felt like the texture of a dried riverbed. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't shiny. It was rough, tactical, and virtually indestructible. They called it the Black Crackle. In a move of patriotic genius, or perhaps calculated scarcity marketing, Blaisdell announced that Zippo would cease all sales to the civilian market. You could not buy a Zippo in a department store in New York or Chicago. You could not order one from a catalog. Every single lighter that came off the line in Bradford was crated up and shipped directly to the post exchanges of the United States Army and Navy. The factory was effectively conscripted. This decision transformed the Zippo from a mere consumer product into a military artifact. For the millions of young men drafted into service, the Black Crackle Zippo became standard issue equipment, as vital as their boots or their dog tags. It was the GI's lighter. The relationship between the American soldier and his Zippo was intimate and profound. In the jungles of Guadalcanal or the freezing forests of the Ardennes, the Zippo was often the only source of warmth and light a man had. It became a multi-tool of survival. The windproof chimney, originally designed for a country club terrace, was perfectly suited for the deck of a destroyer in a gale or the open door of a C-47 transport plane. Stories began to drift back from the front lines, creating a mythology that no advertising agency could ever invent. Soldiers reported using their Zippos to heat cans of soup in their helmets when field kitchens were miles behind. They used the flame to sterilize knife blades for emergency surgery. They used the polished inside of the lid as a signal mirror to flash aircraft. They used the fluid to clean grease off their rifles. There were darker, more miraculous stories too. There was the verified account of a private who took a bullet to the chest, only to survive because the round struck the Zippo in his shirt pocket. The lighter was destroyed, the steel case mangled and fused together by the impact of the lead. But the man lived. The Zippo had literally sacrificed itself for the user. These stories circulated through the platoons and the companies, turning the black metal box into a talisman. It was a lucky charm that smelled of fuel. The black crackle finish, initially a compromise born of shortage, became a symbol of the grit of the generation. As the soldiers used them, the black paint would wear down on the corners and the high spots, revealing the glint of the steel underneath. This wear pattern was unique to every man. You could tell how long a soldier had been in theater by how much steel was showing on his lighter. It was a patina of survival. Back in Bradford, the factory was running 24 hours a day. Bladel was obsessive about quality control. Even though they were making millions of units for a war zone, he refused to let standards slip. He knew that if a lighter failed in a foxhole, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean a man couldn't light the fuse on a demolition charge. It could mean a man couldn't signal his squad. This era cemented the famous guarantee, "It works or we fix it free." This wasn't just a slogan. It was a moral contract. Bladel set up a dedicated repair clinic in the factory. If a soldier sent a broken Zippo back from the front, perhaps crushed by a tank tread or dropped from a bomber, the technicians in Bradford didn't just toss it in the scrap bin and send a new one. They painstakingly repaired the original. They hammered out the dents. They replaced the hinge pins. They re-welded the cam. They understood that to the soldier, that specific lighter with its specific scratches and worn paint was irreplaceable. It held the memory of fear, of boredom, of victory. To replace it would be to erase the history. So they fixed it, packaged it with a new flint and a small bottle of fluid, and mailed it back to the war. By 1945, the Zippo had conquered the world. It was in the pockets of generals and privates alike. It had been carried onto the beaches of Normandy and the black sands of Iwo Jima. When the war ended and the troops came home, they brought their Zippos with them. The scarcity in the civilian market during the war years had created a massive pent-up demand. But more importantly, the returning veterans had been imprinted with the device. They didn't want the fancy table lighters or the delicate Art Deco pieces of the 1920s. They wanted the box that clicked. The black crackle finish was retired as brass became available again. But the soul of the lighter had been hardened in the fires of the conflict. The Zippo was no longer just a lighter. It was a piece of America. It represented a philosophy that was rapidly disappearing from the industrial landscape. The idea that an object should be heavy, simple, and capable of enduring the worst conditions imaginable. The Golden Age and the Plastic Enemy. The Golden Age of the 1940s and 50s saw the Zippo become the ultimate canvas for American identity. Companies started engraving their logos on them. Sports teams, military units. You could read a man's biography by looking at his lighter. Was he a Union man? A Ford man? A member of the 82nd Airborne? The Zippo was the original social media profile, a metal status update that you carried in your pocket. Bladel stood on the factory floor, watching the brass sheets feed into the presses, the air thick with the noise of American dominance. He had built a fortress of reliability. He believed that he had created the perfect object, immune to the ravages of time and fashion. He believed that as long as men needed fire, they would need a Zippo. He didn't see the plastic storm gathering on the horizon, the cheap, colorful tide that was about to wash over the world and extinguish the value of permanence. He only heard the clink of the lid and the roar of the machines, the heartbeat of an empire that thought it would live forever. The enemy that arrived on the shores of America in the 1970s did not come with guns or tanks. It came in a shipping container from France, and it was made of cheap, colorful, injection-molded plastic. It was the era of the disposable, the dawn of the throwaway society. And it would prove to be a more formidable foe to the Zippo Empire than the German Army or the Great Depression ever were. For decades, the Zippo had reigned supreme because it was a machine. It demanded a relationship with the user. You had to feed it fluid. You had to trim the blackened wick with a pair of tweezers. You had to replace the tiny flint when it wore down to a nub. This ritual of maintenance was the price of ownership. It was a tacit agreement that you were responsible for your own fire. But the cultural mood was shifting. The generation that had survived the war and the depression, the generation that saved aluminum foil and straightened bent nails, was aging. A new generation was rising, one that had grown up in the post-war boom of abundance. They didn't want to fix things. They didn't want to smell like naphtha fuel. They wanted convenience. They wanted instant. Enter Marcel Biche. The French industrialist had already revolutionized the way the world wrote by taking the fountain pen, a messy, leaking, refillable tool, and replacing it with the Bic ballpoint, a cheap plastic stick that you used until it died and then tossed in the trash. Now he turned his gaze to the lighter. The arrival of the Bic lighter and its competitor, the cricket, was the industrial equivalent of an invasive species. These devices were alien to the philosophy of Bradford, Pennsylvania. They were sealed units. You couldn't open them. You couldn't refill them. They were filled with butane gas under pressure, not liquid fuel. And most importantly, they were cheap. Dirt cheap. A Zippo in the 1970s might cost $5 or $6. A Bic cost 99 cents. You could buy one at a gas station counter with loose change. If you lost it, you didn't care. If it broke, you threw it away and bought another one. The betrayal here was not just economic, it was spiritual. The American consumer, who had once prided himself on carrying a tool that would last a lifetime, suddenly decided that permanence was a burden. The heavy brass object in the pocket was replaced by a featherweight piece of plastic that felt like nothing. The Zippo was a loud device. The click-clack of the lid was a mechanical announcement. The flame was a ragged, dancing yellow tongue that struggled in the wind but refused to die. The disposable lighter was silent. It hissed quietly. The flame was a sterile, perfect blue needle. It had no smell. It had no soul. It was a utilitarian spark, stripped of all romance and danger. The Zippo Manufacturing Company looked at this plastic tide with horror. They were a company built on a single premise. It works, or we fix it free. How do you compete with a competitor whose slogan is effectively, "It works until it doesn't, and then who cares?" The Austrian management in Bradford tried to hold the line. They doubled down on the heritage. They marketed the Zippo as a rugged outdoor tool, a manly accessory in an increasingly effeminate world. But the numbers were undeniable. The market share was bleeding away. Smokers, the primary engine of the lighter economy, were defecting in droves. Why carry a bottle of fluid and a pack of flints when you could just carry a Bic? This existential crisis led to a period of desperate confusion within the company. They saw the writing on the wall. The world was moving to butane. It was cleaner. It didn't evaporate. It didn't taste like chemicals when you lit a cigar. So in a move that felt like a betrayal of their own bloodline, Zippo tried to become what they hated. They launched products that attempted to bridge the gap. They released butane lighters that were produced in Japan, not Bradford. They were expensive. They were complex. They failed. But the ultimate insult came with the Zippo Blue. The Zippo Blue was a tragic attempt to modernize the icon. It had a metal case and hinged lid, but inside, the guts were ripped out. The cotton batting, the felt pad, the wick were replaced by a complex pressurized butane tank. When you opened a Zippo Blue, it didn't make the famous clink. When you lit it, there was no soft yellow flame. There was a harsh jet blue torch. It was a disaster. The Zippo Blue pleased no one. Traditionalists hated it because it wasn't a real Zippo. Modern consumers hated it because it was still too expensive compared to a Bic. This failure was symbolic of the broader collapse of American manufacturing in the face of the plastic age. The Zippo engineers were masters of brass and steel. They knew how to make a hinge that would last 50 years. They did not know how to make disposable plastic valves. The factory in Bradford kept running, but the atmosphere had changed. The ubiquity was gone. In the 1940s, every man had one. By the 1990s, the Zippo had become a niche object. The plastic enemy had won the war for the pocket. They had convinced the world that ownership was a hassle. The landfill sites of America began to fill up with billions of dead plastic lighters. Meanwhile, the Zippos being made were increasingly destined not for pockets, but for display cases. The betrayal was complete when the company realized that their most loyal customers were no longer users, but collectors. People were buying Zippos and never filling them with fluid, never striking the flint. The lighter had become a museum piece, a nostalgic token of a time when we built things to last. The final extinction, the final siege of the Zippo empire did not happen on a battlefield, nor did it happen in a boardroom. It happened in the air itself. For nearly 60 years, the atmosphere of American life had been blue with tobacco smoke. It was the medium in which the Zippo lived. The lighter sat on the mahogany desks of executives next to the heavy glass ashtrays. It rested on the formica tables of diners. It was passed hand to hand in the break rooms of factories. The clink of the lid opening was the punctuation mark of a conversation, a sound that signaled a pause, a moment of reflection, or the start of a negotiation. But as the 1990s progressed, the atmosphere began to clear. The cultural war on tobacco had begun in earnest, and it was a war of total annihilation. The Clean Indoor Air Acts swept across the country like a cold front. First, the offices went smoke-free, then the airplanes, then the restaurants, and finally the bars. The habitat of the Zippo was systematically destroyed. The lighter, once a symbol of sophistication and adulthood, was rebranded as a mechanism of death. Carrying a Zippo in your pocket went from being a standard accessory for a grown man to being a mark of a pariah. If you pulled a Zippo out in a public park in the year 2000, you didn't get admiring glances at the brass casing. You got dirty looks. You were a polluter. You were a relic. The Zippo Manufacturing Company found itself in a terrifying position. They had built the perfect mousetrap, but the world had decided to ban the mice. The utility of the object collapsed. A Zippo is a fire maker, yes, but its primary design, the chimney, the fuel reservoir, the one-handed operation, was optimized for one specific act: lighting a cigarette in the wind. Without the cigarette, the lighter became an orphan. This cultural exile was most poignantly visible in the death of the concert moment. For a generation, the Zippo had a sacred function at concerts. When the house lights went down and the band began to play a power ballad, 10,000 mechanical clicks would sound out. 10,000 thumbs would strike 10,000 flint wheels. The arena would be illuminated by a sea of living flames. It was a communal act. The heat from thousands of Zippos would raise the temperature in the venue. It was dangerous. It was primal. Then came the cell phone. In the early 2000s, the sea of fire was replaced by cold blue pixels. The audience stopped holding up flames. They started holding up screens. The Zippo had been evicted from the cathedral of rock and roll, replaced by the same device that was killing the wristwatch and the camera. The flame was literally extinguished from the public consciousness. To survive this extinction event, the company in Bradford had to make a pivot that was, in its own way, a tragic admission of defeat. They stopped selling the Zippo as a tool and started selling it as a trinket. They pivoted to the collector. If you open a Zippo catalog from the 1940s, you see plain brushed chrome, plain brass, maybe a simple monogram. It was a hardware catalog. If you open a catalog from the modern era, you see a kaleidoscope of pop culture. Zippos covered in high-definition graphics of wolves, dragons, unicorns, and pin-up girls. Zippos branded with the logos of video games and energy drinks. Zippos studded with Swarovski crystals. The company realized that since people weren't using the lighters to burn things anymore, they were buying them to look at them. The Zippo became a zombie tool, an object that still possessed all the functional capability of its ancestors, but was dead inside because it would never be used. The ultimate symbol of this shift is the orange safety sticker. Every new Zippo sold today comes with a bright orange seal across the back, warning the user that the lighter is flammable. But for the collector, that sticker is a seal of the tomb. To remove the sticker is to lower the resale value. To fill the lighter with fluid is to ruin it as a mint-condition collectible. So millions of Zippos are purchased, taken home, and placed on display shelves, still in their boxes, with the orange sticker intact. The flint never sparks. The wick never burns. The cotton never tastes the fuel. They are monuments to a lost utility. They are like swords, hung on a wall in a house where no one knows how to fence. The lifetime guarantee that George Bladel was so proud of becomes irrelevant because a tool that is never used can never break. The factory on Barber Street still stands, and the stamping presses still thunder. The quality of the Zippo has not declined. This is the unique tragedy of this story compared to others. Unlike the toy companies or the tool companies that shipped their production overseas and switched to plastic to save money, Zippo stayed in Bradford. They stayed loyal to the metal. A Zippo made today is mechanically identical to one made in 1950. It is still a masterpiece of stamping and assembly. But a perfect tool in a world that doesn't need it is a lonely thing. The Zippo competes today not against other lighters, but against the very concept of permanence. We live in the age of the lithium-ion battery and the disposable vape. We live in an era where recharging has replaced refilling. The idea of maintaining a mechanical object, of getting your hands dirty with soot and fuel, of learning the quirks of a specific hinge, is alien to the modern consumer. We want magic, not mechanics. We want the light to appear when we touch the glass, and we want it to vanish when we swipe away. The ghost of the Zippo empire is the ghost of tactile reality. George Bladel wanted to give the American hand something to hold on to. He wanted to give us a sense of control. When you strike a Zippo, you are creating fire. You are manipulating the elements. It is a small, fierce act of creation. When you flick a Bic, you are consuming a product. When you tap a phone screen, you are interacting with a simulation. The legacy of the Zippo is a heavy, rectangular silence. It is the silence of a drawer full of grandfather's things that we are too sentimental to throw away, but too modern to use. It is the silence of a windproof chimney that has nothing to fight against because we spend all our lives indoors. The tragedy is not that the Zippo failed. The tragedy is that it succeeded in being the perfect object for a world that no longer exists. We traded the smell of naphtha for the smell of nothing. We traded the warm, yellow, dancing chaos of a real flame for the cold, steady, sterile light of an LED. And in that trade, we lost more than just a lighter. We lost the connection to the physical, dangerous, beautiful world that the Zippo was built to survive. The lid is closed now. The cam is locked, and the brass is cold, waiting for a spark that is never going to come.